Last year, preached through the book of Exodus. And one of the questions I asked around that, and I'm going to ask you again here this morning, does God delight in cursing his people? Or does God delight in blessing his people? God delights in blessing his people. God does not delight in cursing his people. He delights in blessing his people. This is a fundamental question to answer, which will really determine not just your view of God, but your view of yourself, and ultimately how you live life out of that. If I see God as one who's just waiting up there to slap me upside the head when I do something wrong, for the other shoe to drop, it's going to impact how I live my life out. If I view God as one who is abundant and rich in mercy, in grace, and redemption, who delights in blessing, that is going to shape out how I live my life also. It's going to determine whether I live a life of complaining and judging and critiquing other people, or am I going to live a life of rejoicing and blessing and showing mercy and compassion and kindness towards other people? And it comes from this word that we've been dialing heavily into, our hearts. One is a heart that is an unbelieving, hardened heart, out of which comes grumbling, out of which comes judgmentalism and critiquing of others. The other is a heart that is a believing heart, a regenerated heart, a heart out of which rejoicing at the work of God of others comes out of, and a heart ultimately which abundantly flows the very mercy and grace that we have received from a merciful God towards others. Turn with me to Luke chapter 6. This is one of the hardest, if not actually the hardest, ethic to live out for us as human beings. In fact, it's impossible. The words we heard in the gospel a few minutes ago. These are actually some of the most famous words in the Bible. I think you don't have to think too hard. If you're a Christian, you've been in the church for very long, you've heard people quote these words. In fact, someone who may know nothing else in the whole Bible knows these two words. Jesus said, "Don't judge." That gets thrown out there a lot of times by people who have never even opened up the Bible. And it's taken from this passage here in Luke. But this is a really, really challenging passage for us. And this passage, since I always like to look at context of things, and we're Luke chapter 6, this is basically the Sermon on the Mount passage in the Gospel of Luke. And it's embedded in that. All right, this is Luke's sort of accounting of the Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount. So if you look back up there, starting at verse 17, it talks about him coming down. He sees a great crowd, people gathering from everywhere to hear him. He's healing them of their diseases, and the crowd's there. Verse 20, it says, "And he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." Here's the Beatitudes in Luke's accounting. Verse 24, "Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry." So he works through the Beatitudes here. And then verse 27 is really the immediate context for our passage. And these are some of the hardest words for us to hear. And quite frankly, because they're so hard, we sort of push them aside. Jesus said, verse 27, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from the one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you visit as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those who lend, if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? It sounds a lot like the parable we went through a couple weeks ago when Jesus said, who do you invite to your table? Like you're throwing a feast, who do you invite? If you're just inviting people who are going to invite you back to another feast, what benefit is that to you? Jesus said, even sinners lend to sinners to get back the same amount. Verse 35. This is the verse that leads into our passage here today. But love your friends. Is that what he says there? Love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaking together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with what measure you will use, it will be measured back to you. And he tells them this parable. How can a blind lead the blind? They're both going to fall into a pit. The disciple's not above his master. And then he gets to this very famous parable which says, hey, look, before you go to take the speck out of your brother's eye, you might want to look at the log that's sticking out of your own first, right? This is really famous stuff. Judge not, lest you be judged. So let me spend a few minutes. As I was working on this earlier in the week, I was really focusing on the judging part of this and trying to dive into that. As I got later here in the week, I really started to reflect more upon the nature and character of God being a merciful and rich God, and connecting that to what we've been talking about over these last several weeks. Jesus keeps interacting with the Pharisees, and he keeps saying to them, your hearts are hard, and they reveal themselves as such because you refused me, and you complain, and you actually oppose God. But a heart that receives me, that's believing, is a heart that rejoices in the work of God. And so last week we did this heart check, and that's what I want to continue to build on. Last week the heart check was around a hardened, unbelieving heart complains about others, and that's how we got to the parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son. The Pharisees were complaining. Hey, they refused to come to the table, to the feast that they were invited to, and then they looked at the people who were coming in and go, how could you accept them? How can you receive these guys? Really? They refused to come, and then they complained about those who actually showed up, the lame and the crippled and the poor, those outside. And he's like, Jesus says, look, there's more rejoicing in the kingdom of heaven over one sinner that repents. So today, Jesus is saying, hey, look, don't judge. And I want to build on this. I want to build, first off, this heart of one that is unregenerate, unbelieving, that's hardened to God, that complains and grumbles about what others do, but then even more so, judges and critiques others. And then I'm going to tie that into why we should do that ultimately, because it's not in line with the very nature and character of God, and then who we extend that to. So let's spend a few minutes on the word, we're not to judge. We're not to pass judgment on others. Judgmentalism comes from a heart. Now, I've heard Timothy Keller probably about 10,000 times over the last several years say something along the default position of the human heart is one of performance-based methodology. That the default nature of our heart is one where we look at God, that if I obey and I do the right things, he'll be happy with me, and if I don't, he won't be happy with me. Judgmentalism is really tied into this default position of the heart. We cannot measure up to the law of God. The law of God is perfect, and it hangs over us. The issue with the Pharisees is they had hard hearts, and they lived their lives in such a way where they picked and chose, they cherry-picked from the law what they could do, and they looked down on everybody else. And it's no different for you and I. We ultimately, all of us, in the default position of our hearts, look at parts of the law, look at the things that, oh, I do better at these sort of things, and I start to measure myself and my relationship with God, and then the sorts of the other parts of the law which I don't do so well, and I sort of just like kind of ignore those or push those aside, and I look down on others who don't do as good a job at the areas that I think I'm strong at. But we all fail to live up to these things, and it's rooted in pride, and will break. You will break. I have broken under this, and you will break under this. Ultimately, you'll break, or you'll just abandon trying to live for God. I mean, ultimately, that's what I did. That's all I did as a young man in the Marines. I went into the Marines with a performance mindset, raised in the church, a lot of brokenness inside. I guess some of you guys know the story. But I got in the Marines. I found I could not measure up because I was trying to measure my whole worth before God by what I did, doing the right things and not doing the wrong things. And it was unsustainable. And eventually I came to this place like, God, I can't do this, and I abandoned God. Not because I didn't believe him, but because the law pressed on me so hard, and I couldn't live that way anymore. But it's rooted in pride. It's rooted in a sense, go back to my first question, does God delight in cursing us or in blessing us? Judgmentalism comes out of this really root nature of the heart. And if it's in an unbelieving, unregenerate heart, it is going to see itself out in critiquing and judging of others. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. I only brought 2 books with me today. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, in a couple different places, goes after pride. Why did Jesus go after the Pharisees over and over again? Because they were proud and they were arrogant. Over and over again. You guys are proud and you're full of arrogance. And you're judging other. You are the blind leading the blind. The parable that he tells here, can a blind man not lead a blind? They're the blind leading the lost, leading the sheep of Israel. And it's not a good place to be. But it's rooted in pride. C.S. Lewis says this, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only having more of it than the next man. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer or cleverer or better looking than others. If everyone else became equally rich or clever or good looking, there would nothing to be proud of. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition is gone, pride is gone. It is the comparison that makes you proud. See, this is judgmentalism, and this is what the Pharisees are doing. It is comparing yourself to others. We do it all the time. I would gather if each of us paused for just a moment and thought about our day. There are multiple times in a day in which we spend our time comparing ourselves to others and measuring ourselves up in sort of like the position jockeying that's going on. And we do it because it comes out of our subconscious, comes out of our sin nature. Now let me add to this from Lewis in another part of Mere Christianity. Lewis says this. He says, I hope you not misunderstand what I'm going to say. I'm not preaching. Heaven knows I do not pretend to be better than anyone else. I'm only trying to call attention to a fact. The fact is this year or this month, or more likely this very day, we have failed to practice ourselves the kind of behavior we expect from other people. There may be all sorts of excuses for us. That time you were so unfair to the children is when you were very tired. That slightly shady business about the money, the one you've almost forgotten, came when you were very hard up. And what you promised to do for old so-and-so and have never done, well, you never would have promised if you'd known how frightfully busy you were going to be. And as for your behavior toward your wife or husband or sister or brother, if I knew how irritating they could be, I would not wonder at it. And who the dickens am I, anyway? I am just the same. That is to say, I do not succeed in keeping the law of nature very well. And the moment anyone tells me I'm not keeping it, See if you guys can relate to this. There starts up in my mind a string of excuses as long as your arm. The question at the moment is not whether they are good excuses. The point is they are one more proof of how deeply, whether we like it or not, we believe in the law of nature. If we do not believe in decent behavior, why should we be so anxious to make excuses for not having behaved decently? The truth is, we believe in decency so much, we feel the rule of law pressing down on us, that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it. And consequently, we try to shift the responsibility. For you notice that it is only for our bad behavior that we find all these explanations. It's only for our bad temper that we put down to being tired or worried or hungry. I think we call that hangry these days. We put our good temper down to ourselves. Look, what Lewis is trying, well, I think you got what Lewis is trying to say, because I think we all relate to it very well. Judgmentalism comes out of pride, and it's insidious. It's in the very nature of our being, and we measure ourselves this way, and ultimately it leads to measuring other people, and we critique and we judge out of this spirit of pride. And when it gets played out into the church as a whole, this is sort of what we call legalism. Then, and if you guys have ever been in a legalistic, has anyone ever been in a legalistic sort of church or setting? Yeah, you don't have to raise your hand. I'll let you answer that personally. When it's applied that way, it is life-stealing, because we don't serve a God who delights in cursing us. We serve a God who delights in blessing us. The last year I was in the Marines, and I was getting ready to, the Lord rescued me, and I went to the young pastor, college pastor, First Baptist Church in San Clemente, and I'm like, I know I'm called to be a preacher. What am I supposed to do? He's like, you need to go to Bible college. He's like, you should go to Moody Bible, where I went. So I looked at Moody. I didn't want to go to Moody. I just want to go back home to Arizona. I spent 3 years in the Marines, 4 years in the Marines, just dreaming of coming back home to Arizona. I got Arizona Highway subscription the whole time I was in the Marines, so I did. So I missed home. So I looked at a couple Bible colleges here. So this is 1989 and 1990. And I grew up not in fundamentalism, but in sort of very conservative evangelicalism that bordered on the line of fundamentalism. But that was back in the day, so this is not that long ago. You know, when you went to Moody or any of these other Bible colleges, they had this like list of rules of what you could and could not do as long as both of my arms. Like, it was insane. Now, some of the things, you know, and I was a Marine, I grew up sort of in that culture and all that other kind of stuff, but God had changed me in that time period. You had to wear a suit and tie to church every Sunday, not just Sunday morning, but Sunday night. Churches used to have church both Sunday morning and Sunday nights. That's gone in our culture, but you guys might remember those days. But at Moody, as a Moody Bible student, I had to wear a suit and tie to church every Sunday morning and every Sunday night. It's all right. I couldn't grow a beard, though, at Moody Bible Institute in 1990. Couldn't grow a beard. Had to shave. One time I got told to shave because I let it go for about a week, you know. And again, all these rules, right or wrong, I don't know. Some of them, I think you could probably make a stronger biblical argument for men should have beards than not, but I won't be legalistic about it. So it was really fascinating because D.L. Moody, this life-size statue of D.L. Moody was there with his beard down to here, and yet couldn't have a beard there. It was a mixture of things. Look, there are biblical rights and wrongs that we should all do and not do. And then there's a whole bunch of different little individual convictions that maybe God is giving you convictions that you should do this or not do that. You want to be really careful about holding someone else to your own personal biblical conviction about what they should or should not do. We don't want to pick the speck out of someone else's eye when we have a beam sticking out of our own. And then there's a whole bunch of rules that sometimes in legalistic churches, and there's just a list, and they hammer away on that list. And if you don't measure up to that list, then you're not a good Christian. Run away from that kind of. It's not helpful. It's a judgmental Pharisaism. Our God is a God who is rich in mercy. And quite frankly, the hardest Christian ethic to live out is the words that Jesus put here. Love your enemies and do good to them. Forgive everyone as you've been forgiven in Christ. Give, not expecting anything in return. In most legalistic sort of churches, these aren't the things that are tended to be emphasized. It's other things. Not going to movies, not playing cards back in the day, things like that. I mean, things that some of you younger people may think is weird, but there was all kinds of crazy rules back in the day about certain things. But this ethic here is the ethic we're all called to live out, and none of us live it out. None of us live it out. None of us love our enemies the way that Jesus calls us to. And we all feel the guilt of it. And so we sort of, at some level, push away those things. Again, getting back into Lewis's words, that we find really hard to do. So how do we do this? Here's the question. If we're called not to judge people, not to critique people, and that's like the default mechanism of my heart, and it is. But I'm called to be merciful to people, to forgive, to lend without expecting anything in return, to love my enemies. It's impossible. I can't do it. There's a reason why you can't do it. It's because we're not capable of doing it in and of ourselves. And the last thing I want you to walk out of here today going like, okay, I'm going to walk out of here and I'm going to stop critiquing people and being judgmental of people, and now I'm just going to be merciful and forgiving to them. And you'll get about 2 days in your own flesh before you fail in that again. What we need is the same answer we need for everything. We need, again, I'll quote Keller here, we need to apply the gospel to our hearts. I like to rephrase Keller because I think I like to rephrase Keller and at least take that, apply the gospel to our hearts. We need to be renewed in the gospel every day. What does that mean, to apply the gospel to our hearts? Be renewed in the gospel. We need to come in touch with the mercy and the grace of God every day. It's not out of my old heart in which I'm going to be able to love and forgive people. It's out of the new heart that I'm given by Christ. And it's out of my new nature and out of the Spirit of God who lives in me. And when day by day I go into His Word, or we gather here on Sundays, right, the grace of God comes to me. And my heart and my mind, as I receive those in faith, are changed. And I am undone again by God's mercy. Here's the two things that struck me over the last couple days. As I said, I was trying to move this more from judgment into God. Look back at verse 35. When I say, does God delight in blessing or cursing? I'm not just making this up. What does Jesus say about the nature of God in verse 36? Be merciful even as your Father is merciful. Is merciful. What is the nature of God? His nature is mercy. How does God declare Himself to Moses when He puts him in the cleft of the rock and Moses has to see His glory? He puts him in the cleft of the rock. He passes by, and the very first word out of God's mouth, out of Yahweh's mouth, when He declares who He is to Moses, what is the word? The Lord is merciful. It's the very first word that God declares of Himself to Moses. Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh is merciful, and He's gracious, abounding in grace, and loving. The very first description of God to Moses. What does Paul say about God in Ephesians chapter 2? But God being, verse 4, but God being rich in mercy has made us alive together in Christ Jesus. By grace you have been saved. God is merciful. Do you believe that God is merciful? When we say the prayer of humble access every Sunday here before we come to the communion table, we say, I don't presume to come to this table trusting in my own righteousness, right? But trusting in your abundant mercy. Because God The old language, whose property is always to show mercy. His nature is always to show mercy. He is merciful. At the core of God's heart, he is merciful. But I want to bump up to literally the last phrase of the sentence right before this passage, because this is what struck me. Luke says here in verse 35, love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you'll be sons of the Most High. Catch this. For he is kind. That's merciful, right? He is kind. He's compassionate. Who is he kind towards? Who does that verse say he is kind towards? He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. God is merciful. And who is he merciful to? Who is he kind to? The ungrateful and the evil. This is the contrast that Jesus continually puts forth throughout his ministry. He's looking at the Pharisees. He's walking around them. They are the blind leaders of Israel. What is their behavior towards who they consider to be sinners, who they consider to be ungrateful and evil? What is their attitude towards them? They grumble against them. They oppose them. Lame man, the sick man comes into this feast in front of their very eyes. Jesus heals them, and they sit there disgruntled and say nothing. They oppose the work of God. Their whole heart towards sinners is one of hate. They're proud. They're arrogant. What is Jesus' attitude? He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Who are the ungrateful and evil? Us. Us. We are born into this world with sin nature. We are born with a propensity to sin, and we do sin. We are born, as Paul says in Romans chapter 8, a little bit before Christopher read it, we are born, those who do not have the Spirit of God are hostile towards God. But what does Paul say earlier in Romans chapter 5? What does it say here? God is kind towards the evil and the ungrateful. Romans 5:8. God demonstrates his love. That's kindness. That's mercy. That's goodness. That's grace. God demonstrates his love towards us in that while we were still sinners, when we were still ungrateful, when we were still dead in our trespasses and sins, Christ died for us. Christ died for you. I bring nothing to the table. God has done it all in Jesus. He is merciful. You guys know Psalm 23. What does David say there? He says, you anoint my head with oil, and my cup, is it like a quarter full? My cup like half full? Like kind of almost full to the top? Full to the brim? Or is it overflowing? My cup overflows. What is this cup overflowing with? The mercy and kindness of God towards him. What does Jesus say here? Look, how you judge other people, like the measure with which you judge other people, right? That's the measure what's going to be coming to you. But God, who is merciful, who's kind to the ungrateful and evil, this is what Jesus says. Look, forgive and you'll be forgiven. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. It overflows. This is the measure that God has given to us in Jesus. How do we forgive our enemies? How do we love freely? How do we bless those who curse us? We come in contact with God every day, and his gospel, and his mercy, and his riches, and his abundance, and we allow that to flow in our whole being, in our mind, in our hearts, and go, who am I, O Lord, that you would take me? Who am I that you would take me from the sheepfold and save me? Who am I, O Lord, that you would rescue me? This lost sheep who was hostile towards you. And that change, and when I sit with that and go, his richness of mercy is overflown, and then we live that life out, and so that mercy flows naturally and that compassion flows naturally out towards others. We don't manufacture it. It's not something we have to go like, I gotta love this person now. I'm gonna be merciful to them. No, because I've been undone by the grace and mercy of God as I come into contact with people who may not be very nice to me. I can pause. What have I received from you, O Lord? Let me flow that out to others. This is hard stuff. This is the hardest stuff. I say this in my classes at GCU. You know, people think like the sexual ethic. I agree with Lewis in here. Think the sexual ethic of chastity is hard. And it is. But it's not the hardest Christian ethic. It's forgiving your enemies. It's loving those who don't love you, who hate you. That's the hardest ethic. And it's impossible for us to do. We can't do it in our own power. We have to apply the gospel. We have to allow the gospel to renew us every day. We come here, receive the mercy of God once again in his word. We come here to this table, which set in the midst of our enemies. One of the other things that Lewis talks about in Mere Christianity is like, we're little outposts of the kingdom of God here on this planet. In a world that's in rebellion, we are going to come to this table, set in the midst of our enemies, whom we're called to love, and dine and feast on the riches that God gives us in Jesus. And we do that every week. And it's so important and it's so vital. There's no other answer. Do I want to live a life that's continually looking at other people and critiquing them and judging them for all the ways they don't measure up? Or do I want to live a life which has compassion and mercy towards other people? How many times have you made a quick judgment on someone and somewhere a little bit later down the line you heard there was other extenuating circumstances and you went like, maybe I shouldn't have jumped to that, right? The only way to live this life is allow the mercy and grace of God, the amazing grace that saved a wretch like me, to impact me every day, and so that can flow out of me towards others, because that's what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen.